Hello guys, this is your friend and we are back with a new fanfic. Which is what if Naruto is denied training by Kakashi Sasuke bashing part 1. And if you enjoy this fanfic then please press the like button and subscribe to my channel for more fanfic like this. And now let's start the fanfic. It all started with a jutsu, well, the implementation of a jutsu, and of course some prick getting special treatment because he's some big important bloodline survivor. The previous match of the first round in the tournament had ended almost 4 hours ago. Since then, everybody had been put on hold for the precious Uchiha. The blonde shinobi ground his teeth as he watched the spectators slowly thinning. Enough was enough. The Uchiha had been given special treatment for the last time if he could do anything about it. If the old man refused to settle this and move on with the rest of the matches, then Naruto would publicly prank him. Right here, right now, to give the spectators a good show. Heading up to the Hokage's stand, the single cage Bunshin knew his job. Ask the old man to move on, and if denied, as the boss expected he would be. Then disperse. Not that big a prank, except for the massive amount of water he had drank after being created, which was still sloshing around in his belly. The plan was, he dispels and the water gets left behind to splash the Hokage. Vaguely, the Bunshin wondered if maybe learning that Freak Zabuza's water Bunshin would have been worth begging Kakashi-sensei for it. He knew the man had copied it, but then, he didn't seem all that interested in his other students. Finally at the cage box, the Bunshin nodded to the Chunin guards, "Hey, mind if I ask the Hokage-sama, about my teammates' match?" Looking at each other, the Chunin obviously considered turning him away. But of course, the fact he was on the same team as the boy they were all waiting on, made the final decision. He was let through. Having already heard his voice, both cage were looking in his direction, as he entered the seating area reserved just for them. "Naruto, that was a good match you put on, I hope that your showing in the next round is as successful." "Thank you, Hokage-sama." The old man just raised an eyebrow as the exam participant gave a polite bow. "I would like to offer a minor excuse for my teammate. Our sensei is well known for his chronic lateness. And it seems Sasuke may have began to take after him. While Naruto wanted the Tem to be disqualified, simply whining about it would make him look like the idiot. And this Bunshin was not an idiot. Well, not as big of one as his original was anyway. He was well aware of how important it was to act correctly in front of the other cage. That was part of the reason his prank would be so successful. If he had any chance at this, he had to place the old man in a position where he, and this village by relation, would be embarrassed by the Uchiha's behavior. "I won't apologize for it, it's not my place to do so. But that's how it is, and I firmly believe that our sensei will not concern himself with the issue unless an example is made. I understand many people have come out to see this fight more than any of the rest of the matches, but punctuality is vital for a shinobi, and if sensei has passed his habits to my teammate, who already suffers from an inflated ego, then our team will never advance as a whole." The Hokage was quite surprised to say the least. Not only was Naruto displaying manners he'd not possessed to the Hokage's knowledge, he had also used a logic that, while minorly petty, was irrefutable. And, he correctly used the word punctuality. That was a larger surprise than the rest of it. Altogether though, the cage felt he had little choice. This matter being proposed as it was, Sarutobi would lose face if he didn't take action to discipline the Uchiha. Not that he hadn't already considered it. "Very well," the cage gestured to the guard at the entrance of their seating booth. "Chunin, have the proctor announce that if Sasuke isn't here in the next 5 minutes his match is forfeit." The Chunin guard bowed and began to leave, and informed the proctor that even if he is here before then, he has still lost consideration for promotion. This match will only be to evaluate his opponent. "Hi, it shall be as you command, Hokage-sama," and with that, the Chunin vanished in a blur of motion, appearing in the arena next to the proctor. It worked. The Bunshin could barely contain his surprise. The old man had caved almost immediately. And, He didn't even have to prank his adoptive grandfather. The excited chakra construct now only needed to head back and let the boss know. Making a bow, he began his exit. Then, the cage spoke up. His voice was eerily familiar. Hokage Dono, if perhaps the Uchiha is disqualified, then maybe we could pit him against my Gaara once he has won the last of the matches. Okay, so the Bunshin never claimed his boss was that smart, and he probably shouldn't have been so insulted by that comment. Things might have turned out different if the orange-clad copy had just swallowed his pride and continued to leave. But he was still slightly unnerved by the voice, and furthermore, the creep had just counted out all of his friends as well as the boss. Forgive me, Kage-sama, I wouldn't wish to contradict you. However, you shouldn't underestimate the boss so easily. He's completely recovered from his match, and I think Gaara might have a harder time against him than you're expecting. The boss. The Hokage's eyebrow raised slightly, and the Kage's eyes widened sharply. Oops. He had slipped. The jig was up. He was a clone and he had just given that fact away. Your genin would send a simple clone to discuss such issues with you. The masked Kage chuckled. Smooth as ever, the old man had an answer. Of course, he certainly would. He is an expert at the jutsu, as he displayed earlier. The Hokage gave a grin. I have it on good authority that the boy's clones can last longer than even one of my own. In fact, the one time he attempted to test the sheer number of Kage Bunshin he could create, his sensei lost count at 300 square meters of forest covered. That silenced the Kage, and it helped that it was even true. The Bunshin recalled his time in the forest with Iruka and Mizuki. There had been way more clones back then than he'd ever made since, and that had only been moments after he'd gotten it right for the very first time. The construct wondered exactly how many the boss could make now. The Hokage hadn't, of course, mentioned that this was his academy sensei and not the Jonin Kakashi. And the words, of forest, implied that he had been up and down the trees. Which he wasn't. But it made a great impression on the chagrined creep. It was then that they were interrupted by a commotion on the arena floor, as just before the disqualification, his sensei and teammate arrived. They weren't told of the earlier decision about the promotion, but were told they had almost forfeit the match. Well, Bunshin-san, there is your teammate. Why don't you entertain us with your observations of the match? The chilled invitation from the Kage's whispering voice made the Bunshin gulp. The blonde jutsu was unsure how to decline. The Hokage had just said he might last way longer than he had intended to. His decision was made for him, when before he could even reply, the Hokage voiced his agreement. That sounds like an excellent idea, Naruto. Come, stand beside me and tell me your view of your teammate's abilities. Crap, he was stuck up here. If he got dispelled, the prank would be set off even after he'd gotten what the boss wanted. Of course they wanted him to talk about that jerk. When did anyone want to talk about someone else? He'd gladly explain everything he knew about Sakura-chan, or even Shikamaru. I dunno, Hokage-sama. Sensei has been training him for a whole month since I last saw him. He might even surprise me. The masked Kage leaned forward, his voice giving the clone a slimy feeling with the amused tone highlighting it. Oh, a whole month since you saw him. The Uchiha boy must have gotten much stronger since then, receiving personal instruction for all that time. The Hokage even nodded his agreement at what the freak with the creepy voice said. Was it just the Bunshin, or did the Kage sound a little too interested? Turning back to the shadow clone, the old man displayed one of the reasons the boss liked him so much. And what training did your sensei give you that month, I wonder? You've clearly been trained quite well for your last match. Well, he was a little focused on Sasuke, so he asked Ebisu-senpai to show me how to water walk. Naruto's copy wasn't sure he could call the man sensei, except that calling him a closet pervert would ruin all the manners he had shown. The Hokage frowned at this. He knew exactly how long Ebisu had taught the boy, because the man was back to his regular routine the very next day. So it took you a whole month to learn a simple chakra control exercise. The Kage sounded bewildered, obviously doubting his earlier boasts. But the Bunshin was quick to reply, to maintain his dignity, that it only took 2 to 3 hours. Which only a second or so after he had replied, the idiot realized may have been a mistake, because it prompted the Kage to again ask about his training that month. Naruto's clone knew he couldn't mention the Kyuubi, not to this creep. Besides, wasn't it like some big huge target on his back if he did? Of course, telling them he spent the entire time watching an old pervert peep at the hot springs was out of the question too. The Bunshin had no choice, and quickly lied, well after that, I kinda didn't have anything else to work on, so I just trained on my chakra control. Reaching his hand behind him to rub the back of his head, the Bunshin gave a nervous laugh. It was true. Sort of. He was learning to control that other chakra arrow Sannin taught him to access. The Hokage was slightly shocked. He had known that Jiraiya had taught the boy to use the toad summons, but surely that wasn't the only other thing he'd learned. Naruto's performance in the arena displayed much more growth since his bout in the preliminaries. Well, that is certainly a surprise, began the veiled Kage. One would think you'd be able to ask for more instruction. Perhaps, if you earn your promotion today, you could request an apprenticeship. The Kage leaned in towards the genin once more. Find a sensei who'll truly value your abilities. It happens commonly enough. You might convince a jonin to take you under their wing and use that great potential you have pouring out of you. Kuso. That guy was freaking him out. The Uzumaki Jutsu was certain he knew that voice from somewhere. But where? Who had he met recently that was as weird as this guy? You might give the Mitarashi girl a try. I hear she's single, as in doesn't have a genin team. The clone saw the look of amusement on the two elders when he reacted to the memory of the crazy snake lady. Yeah, she kind of fit with the creepy factor. But that wasn't her voice. Of course, if I were you, the Kage continued, I'd be on the lookout for your Hokage's own student. The one who trained the Yondaime. If he could teach you, then a boy of your talents would be a shoo-in for the Godime. At this the Hokage interrupted them, yes, one could only imagine the things he could have done with such an expertise in the Bunshin arts. But I'm afraid we are missing the important match we've been waiting for. Down in the arena, Sasuke's kunai had been deflected by the sand, and he was now running towards the redhead, vanishing from the Bunshin sight, and reappearing the same way Lee had in the preliminaries. It was wrong. The way Sasuke was able to simply copy the technique, hitting the genin with his lion's barrage. The Uchiha fought with speed that the genin copy couldn't even see. What the clone could see was his original, sitting there in the stands, completely shocked. Once again, the Uchiha had pulled leaps ahead of him. And then, when the genius could no longer get to the bloodlusting Jinchuriki, the clone saw the worst possible act of favoritism his sensei had committed thus far. His signature jutsu, the one he used in Wave when the demon of the bloody mist had first attacked them, the jutsu he said was his only original jutsu, was now in the hands of the Uchiha Tem. Sure, the Bunshin didn't expect it to go to his boss. But he had expected the man to have at least taught him something, before he taught Sasuke that one. It was a lethal killing jutsu, the very same one that had ended Haku's life. And he'd just given it to Sasuke, while ignoring his other students. The clone felt a tidal wave of jealousy. Not just for the boss, but also for Sakura-chan. She was alone in the fact that she hadn't made it to the finals. Now the clone wondered if their sensei even saw her when he left, or had she just been spending this whole month at home or out with friends. A blood-curdling scream roused the clone from his inner turmoil. Sasuke's new jutsu landed and hurt Gaara. The wounded genin lashed out with an arm made of hyperdense sand, throwing the Uchiha across the arena to painfully hit the wall on the other side. 00000. As he came into existence, the new Bunshin was unsure of what had happened next. All he knew was the old man had demanded his predecessor make a new clone, and here he was. The older half of their chakra burst, having been flung bodily by the Hokage at the case cage. And with that, his once forgotten prank was issued to the robed figure, who was now soaking wet. Realizing his surroundings, the clone stepped between the two cage. They had moved to the roof of the next building that had been behind them. Foo 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 foo, with that laugh coming from the robes of the esteemed cage, the Bunshin now knew whose voice that sounded like. The Hokage was already moving to fight, his robes had vanished and in their place was the armor of a seasoned warrior. Case cage dono, we need not resort to such measures, any disagree. Hey old man, he's not the case cage at all, there was no time in battle to act all respectful and shit, that guy wasn't even the one he was putting on a show for. He's that snake freak genin that attacked Sasuke in the forest. The third flinched. That the genin, no, the Bunshin of a genin, had realized this before him. How long had the boy known? How many of those strange attempts at manners had been meant to tell him? The Sandaime reflected. The boy is right, sensei, that voice. Hiruzen was much too aware of just what was coming now. I really should confess, when I put the 5 elements seal on you boy, I never thought you would be able to overcome the unbalance it caused. The Hokage sucked back a gasp at the implications. The progress Naruto displayed while training completely on his own, was in spite of his chakra being unbalanced. The faked case cage continued to giggle as he tossed his robes aside. Yet you still managed to improve, even though your chakra was actively being disrupted. I am impressed. It makes me wonder if perhaps my choice in Sasuke-kun was premature. Again, someone chose Sasuke-tem over him. What a fucking surprise. Thinking back, the Bunshin could only guess that the seal the snake freak mentioned, was what beat him in the forest. Wait, didn't the pervert do something to make his chakra relax? Was he fixing that? With a growl, the Sandaime pulled the chakra construct behind him. Orochimaru, whatever your intentions towards the boy, you will not see them fulfilled. Today I correct the mistake I made when I let you leave. 00000. The original Naruto was not aware of his clone's situation, not even aware that the clone was still there. He knew the prank had not been needed, as a Chunin came from the cage booth to talk to the proctor. He just assumed the clone had gone somewhere safe to dispel. What he was aware of, was that his teammate, the one he had been so jealous of only moments ago, had been caught. During the match, he had been slammed against the arena wall. That had to hurt, and that was when Shika had woken him from the genjutsu that covered everything. Quickly reaching Sasuke, the orange-clad genin tried to help him up. He regretted that. The Uchiha had almost hit him when he got close. And so the 4 of them followed the injured Sand genin out into the forest. They were just about to attack when Sasuke fell, clutching at his neck. Of course, that just happened to be when Gaara turned to attack them back. And when his emo-ego-ness was about to dodge the redhead's sand claws, some freaky fire ink spread from his neck, around his face and down his arm. The great Uchiha genius fell right off the tree branch entirely, dropping like a sack of rice. Sakura-chan had tried to catch him, but the only result was that her arm had been broken by the sand claw as it knocked her out of the way and took hold the Uchiha. Challenging Gaara, the blonde Jinchuriki charged as much chakra as he could into his body. He was going to have to move fast. Then to his surprise, the claw holding Sasuke to the tree trunk split apart, leaving a grip on Sasuke, while the arm retracted back to the sand-covered genin. Clasping his hands together, Naruto swore he would be the one to protect everybody. He would save them all. And so the genin created his army of clones, getting a gasp from the chick who had brought Gaara out here. The Tanuki boy demon thing, then turned back to the Pinkett and laughed. When I have beaten you I will feed both of your precious teammates to mother right in front of you. The sand had completely covered the genin now, leaving only his feet sticking out. With the wave of his sand fist, he launched a sand missile at Naruto's free teammate. She wasn't fast enough to get out of the way. It broke through the clones who tried to shield her. And the impact knocked her out of her perch where she landed awkwardly on her ankle, crying out when her leg gave a snap. Attacking the Sand Tanuki with all he had, the determined genin drew on another source of strength. Furious that Sakura-chan had been hurt, and terrified that the Suna demon was targeting her. 00000. The clone couldn't believe it. He was fighting in a battle royal between the third, and his evil student Orochimaru, plus 2 other Hokage. He had almost immediately been shoved aside to remain intact, but feeling his original pull on the Kyuubi's chakra helped make up his mind. The boss was out there fighting, he should be fighting too. While he was being completely ignored by all parties in the battle, he was safe. However, he wanted to help the old man, so he picked up the nearest piece of rubble and threw it at the evil Sannin. The Hokage barked a laugh as the shingle beamed the man's head while he was monologuing. The serpentine shinobi hadn't even realized the ceramic projectile had been thrown until it hit him. Well, that's what you get for ignoring a clone of the next Hokage, isn't it? The cage quickly pulled him out of the area, before it erupted into a churning pit of dust. Once they had a lead away from the others, the elder shinobi quickly showed him a few hand signs and told him that the new jutsu would multiply anything he threw. While it was possible, and more effective to only use one seal for the jutsu, the professor of ninjutsu had intentionally given the clone the full set of seals. This way the construct wouldn't need to try it more than a couple times to perform the jutsu with adequate results. He gave a demonstration of the jutsu by sending a single kunai the reanimated second Hokage, and with the jutsu it became dozens. It'll copy anything I throw. The clone didn't have any kunai with him, so he would need to throw junk from the battle. Yes, Naruto, anything. Now I don't know how much chakra you have left, but try to keep at least one of them distracted for me, would you? Hi. The Bunshin used the jutsu, slowly pulling trace amounts of the fox's chakra into him as he did so. One roof tile became 10 solid chunks of twisted ceramic, a chunk of stone from the broken roof became a dozen equally deformed chunks of rock. This new jutsu was almost exactly like his full clone jutsu. While it required less chakra, it also only needed to be solid to work, so the details were not as taxing as his shadow clone. Still, the Bunshin didn't start using real shinobi tools until he had tried the jutsu numerous times, and once he had it down, the kunai he managed to swipe from the battle became a volley of blades sent at the Sannin. His first attempts had done little to affect the new Kennen, but when he began to send sharp tools it finally got his attention. The snake bastard finally noticed him. So when the Sannin caught one of his kunai, the Bunshin used all the fox chakra he had gathered to create 8 more of himself before the pale man killed him with a flick of his wrist. Luckily the others had bolted the moment of their creation. The Bunshin were alive, they had been created to bombard the living Sannin, as the Hokage found a way to beat the other 2 Hokage. Each of them took a distant position around the battle so all of them wouldn't be killed by any hit that could beat one of them. As long as they were spread out, they could keep replenishing their number. So the clones fought. At least 4 of them at any time were targeting the Sannin. 1 or 2 of them would always cast some projectiles into the old man's fight. As the fight went on, one of their number had finally saved up enough fox chakra to make a new clone, who then attempted to break out. It didn't work. The wall seemed to be made of purple fire. Luckily, the old man looked like he was winning. He had beaten them back twice now. But the dead shinobi reformed from the dust and came at him again. Each time they did, the old man had to abandon the jutsu he was trying to do. Soon the third Hokage had them both reforming, and the old man went for a different jutsu. Quickly signing the hand seals that the clone knew so well, giving the blonde construct an idea. Hey old man, wait a second, I got an idea. He shouted, nodding to another who jumped at the 2 reforming masses of earth crumbs. The Bunshin split into 4 of himself, each one grabbing the reforming cage they were next to, and running with them straight into the wall of chakra fire. With the Hokage dust not fully reformed, it was easy to shove their remains into the wall. especially when the two clone holding each mass of reforming jutsu were willing to burn with them. At that same time the four targeting the Sannin opened up with all they had, which, after the several times he had used it, was only limited by the amount of chakra they put into the jutsu. While he had only been an annoyance with the few kunai and shingles he had been sending at the Sannin, when the clones started sending projectiles by the hundreds, the Sannin decided to end his interference. And the last clone, the one who had continued to pull on the fox's chakra, raced toward the hesitant village leader. The Hokage had almost expected what was to come from the genin's idea. Realizing what the boy intended to do, he decided to give the genin the chance he deserved. So much of the boy's life had already been squandered because of the poor judgments the elderly village leader had made. It was time for him to trust that Naruto could follow through on his boast. The Hokage allowed his arm to be taken and jumped when the boy finally took it. Grasping the outstretched arm of the waiting Hokage, and throwing him up in the air, the Bunshin used the seals for Shadow Clone Projectile Jutsu, ending it with the seal of his own full cage Bunshin Jutsu instead of the final replication seal. It worked, creating a Shadow Hokage clone jutsu. Now that there were 7 of the old man, each with plenty of chakra in them, he had the advantage. As the 7 cage landed, the 2 just made shinobi re-entered the battle. The Sannin had easily taken out the other Bunshin without the man's sensei to keep his attention off of them. But it was too late for the traitor. Having seen what the clone had just done, the Sannin could only stare wide-eyed as the many Hokage attacked with none of the hesitation that held the third startled predecessors in place. It was impossible. Was this what his sensei had meant when he said the boy was a genius with the clone jutsu? The spared a single look at the remaining clone and sent his silent message of all his thoughts and memories out to his hidden contingency. There was little possibility this body would escape alive. The one remaining shadow clone who had performed the impossible jutsu watched, as the man who had taken care of the boss all of his life, used some jutsu to rip the chakra out of the 2 jutsu cage. And then again, out of the snake Sannin. With the battle over, the old man fell to his knees. The massive purple wall of fire around them collapsed, and the several ninja who had seen the battle gathered to help, rushing towards the fading Hokage to provide what medical aid they could. The 6 Hokage clones, seeing the end of the battle, burst. In the end, there was nothing to be done. The gathered Irionen could only bear witness. With the knowledge that he had so much to make up to the boy who had fought beside him, and that his time would soon pass as his jutsu ended and his soul was devoured. The Hokage considered the sheer audacity of the jutsu the boy had just used. Naruto was going to become a great shinobi, as long as this old man ensured nothing held the boy back any longer. Reaching out and grabbing the arm of the nearest medic nin, the Hokage sucked in his breath for his last and final words. As my last act, as Hokage, I grant Naruto Uzumaki a battlefield promotion to Chunin, and declare that his heritage and all his parents' assets are to be released to him. He is to be apprenticed officially to Jiraiya. The old man stopped, gasping for breath. It seemed he knew he couldn't get any more out, and in a harsh voice, he ended his life with the words, "So I decree." Toppling forward, the elder shinobi died with a smile on his face. The clone couldn't believe it. His parents, he was going to know who they were. And then he realized what else had just happened. The old man was dead. Then, the sole remaining clone felt it. Pain. The boss had been hurt. The fox's chakra, which had sustained him, was drawn out of the construct by the original, and he dispelled. 00000. Almost 80 years of information, of memories, of life, bombarded Naruto's mind when the 6 Sandaime Bunshin burst. The pain it caused brought the genin to his knees within the sand of the beast he climbed. It was then that the first truly agonizing wound of many to be dealt that day was inflicted upon him. The sickening crunch of his legs being crushed echoed through the trees as his cry of pain overshadowed it. The blood pouring from his ears left him deaf to the sounds of his screams, while he began choking on the blood from his nose. His head felt like it would explode. This pain was beyond what he had ever felt. Added to it, was the screaming in his legs. One thing made it through the haze of pain: save her. Sakura-chan was hurt, and in danger. He had to save her. Reaching his hands out towards the sleeping vessel, Naruto grasped his sash. Sand swirling from around the boy wrapped over the leaf nin's arms, almost covering them completely to the shoulder, while his shredded legs were suddenly yanked inwards, pulling him from the redhead hang out of the demon's face. When the blonde leaf vessel's grip wasn't broken, the sand tightened, crushing his arms, and covering the genin in even more of his own blood. Still, Naruto pulled. He pulled with his very chakra, calling on the Kyuubi once more, to help him reach his destination. And finally, with one last surge of willpower, the blood-soaked shinobi slammed his blonde locks into the sleeping face of the Ikibi vessel. The result was another sickening crunch, as the boy's nose broke, and he awoke with a scream of pain. The sand demon's towering form crackled and exploded in a flood of sand. While Gaara landed safely on his sand, the leaf ninja wasn't so lucky. The burst of sand had blasted his upper body out, while still holding the remains of his legs deeper in its layers, causing him to flip over end, when he finally was released a fraction of a second later. With no limbs to guide or even cushion his fall, Naruto landed head first into the hard ground, his neck at a crooked angle. His head split, and from it dark red blood and other fluids gushed in fountains. Yet, the boy struggled, the rest of his body finally falling to the ground, leaving the genin face down. Slowly the bloody blonde head turned upwards. Reaching out with the Kyuubi's chakra, the crippled leaf nin pulled himself towards the terrified Suna Jinchuriki. The red arms of chakra resembled a liquid mist of blood, even more so with the amount pouring from the genin they dragged. A trail formed behind him, as he ever so gradually made his way in the Ikibi demon vessel's direction. The Pinkett nearly vomited at the sight of what could only be demonic blood reaching out and dragging a mangled corpse, with 4 torn, shredded and crushed limbs dangling behind it, as small strips of flesh tore completely off when they passed over rougher parts of the ground. What was he? Nothing could live after all that. As the sand fell away from the Uchiha, Sakura tried to catch him with her one good arm. He was awake at least. Seeing the horrific form of their teammate, Sasuke shoved his useless teammate out of the way and began to climb down from the tree, sprinting to intercept the enemy moving in the Dobi's direction. Naruto spoke, telling Gaara of how close they were, of how he could have been the same way as the Suna nin was now, of how his friends had saved him from the pain of being alone. He was nearly to the whimpering redhead when a form appeared in front of him. "Get away from my brother," was the only warning the bloodied boy got before her massive fan swung under and up, catching his face and bunting him into the nearest tree, where he crumpled in a heap. The blonde Kunoichi gathered her brother and began to run. Even as she did, she heard it. "Sasuke-kun. Just leave him, we need to get you to the hospital." "We can't. Not after all he just did for us." And the Uchiha's words were cut off as the Kunoichi pulled him off balance. "I don't care about him. He can go ahead and die already." After hearing the few things she had from the genin she'd intercepted, Tamari knew exactly how crushing those words were. If he lived, he wouldn't live long. 0000. Please live, the fox begged his prison. The boy could live if he only willed it. The brain damage was minor, and most of the other damage could easily be repaired over time. But the brat just didn't want to live. All of those memories from his Hokage Bunshin jutsu had overloaded his meager brains, but not fried them completely. And the bash on the head could be fixed as easily as the broken neck. But the prisoner couldn't do any of it. The Kyuubi no Yoku, greatest of his family, was held at bay by the seal containing him. He could normally heal the boy without the seal interfering because the boy wanted to be healed. This time was much different. This time Naruto didn't want to survive. Even as the boy died, a stronger will took hold. The elderly shinobi stepped up to the gate of his cage. "I know what is wrong, and I know you wish to live as much as I want him to. The Sandaime began. How are you even in the seal, you old monkey? The man was dead. The demon's chakra within the Bunshin had felt the shinobi's life be devoured by the death god. I am not me. Hee, as it were, came his almost giggled reply. I am in fact, a copy of me, made with Naruto-kun's chakra. I can only assume that the reason I didn't pass on to my original, is in part because of the origin of the chakra used to create me, and the fact my original self is dead, although I may still have been sent to him even then, had he not sealed himself into the belly of the death god. Dimly, the collective will of the 6 Hokage Bunshin regretted dispelling. If he had lasted past his original body's demise, he may have been able to correct many of the things he was leaving unfinished. For those reasons, I believe my mind was carried with the rest of Naruto's chakra, back into him. As to why I am still self-aware and not simply a group of memories. It may be that his mind has suffered such a trauma, that it isn't capable of absorbing me as of yet. In truth, the Hokage's will knew that his time was limited, and while he could, he wanted to improve the boy's chances, so he had already begun sorting his own memories. A quick experiment with the Uchiha disaster had already proven to him that he was capable of erasing the memories he was formed out of. We need to act quickly. So long as I will it, your chakra can be moved from the seal, just as if it were Naruto willing it. But, I doubt very much that I will remain after the damage is repaired. So our first priority is to erase all traces of his desire to die. Then, once his will to live is restored, it will be up to you to repair his physical body. During that time, I must ensure, with the remaining moments of my awareness, that he is not burdened by the worst of my nightmares. And so, the 3rd Hokage, and the 9-tailed demon fox, worked hand in hand. And our hero was reborn. Today was a sad day. The entire village mourned. Their Hokage, the 3rd face on the mountain, had died. And today, they held a service for him alone. Tomorrow would be full of services for the other shinobi who had been lost. But today, was meant for him. Naruto was unlike the other shinobi who were out there mourning. He didn't feel sad, he wasn't upset. He didn't miss the man. In fact, Naruto had no idea who the Sandaime even was. Actually, he only knew his own name because someone had told him. The boy was so worried about him. He had actually stayed in his room with him before he woke up. Konohamaru claimed to be his little brother. And when Naruto had no idea who the kid was, the poor child was heartbroken. The nurse who had been there when he woke up immediately called their uncle in to take his brother somewhere else. Naruto didn't recognize the man either. There was a faint glimmer of pity in his face, but mostly he was mourning like the rest of them. Naruto was left there most of the day, not receiving any visitors that he could remember. The empty-minded child could only lay in his bed and wonder about his arms and legs. What had happened to put them in such thick casts? In fact, he was completely strung up like a puppet. He could even feel something on his head and face. He was sure that someone would have told him about it already. But for the life of him, he couldn't remember anyone saying anything about what happened to him. Later that evening another person arrived. He was worried, Naruto could tell. And he was also trying to hide it. Dobi, I heard that you don't remember anything, I just wanted to tell you who I am and that you're not alone. The boy sat on his bed and looked out the window, deliberately facing away from him. My name is Sasuke and we are best friends. We are each other's only friends. We became friends because we both lost our parents. Yours were killed in the Kyuubi attack a few hours after you were born, and mine were killed by a plague that hit my clan. He could tell his friend was holding something back. Something to do with the plague. Not knowing how to respond, he introduced himself. I'm Naruto, it's nice to meet you. They sat and Sasuke explained to him a few things about their life. He was a shinobi. Up until when he was injured, he had been a genin. Now though, he was supposed to be a chunin. Except that he had been hurt in his last mission. He was on Team 7 which consisted of 4 members, him, Sasuke, another person, and their sensei, Hatake Kakashi. They had been on several missions together. And their biggest one had been when they rescued an entire village from the clutches of a merciless tyrant. The evil midget had hired legendary missing shinobi to kill off the man who was leading the village in a rebellion. And they had been hired to protect him. They talked for a while about the mission and about the other members of the team, and soon they even began talking about what they were doing before he was hurt. They were in an exam, meant to test genin to see if they were ready for a promotion. Naruto and another genin had been the only ones promoted. The other genin was Shikamaru, a lazy teen boy from the Nara clan. Sasuke made a point to explain in depth how Naruto had been furious when Hinata was insulted. How he vowed to avenge her loss in the preliminaries, and how, as the Uchiha was told, he had thrashed Neji when they fought because of the beating he had given the girl. It was clearly a sign that they had feelings for one another. And secretly, Sasuke hoped this would help him to move on past the pinkett who had so casually thrown his life away. But in the middle of the final matches, one of the other villages attacked. According to Sasuke, Naruto had managed to use a jutsu that let him be in two places at once. He had fought not only the host of the demon raccoon that had captured Sasuke, but also alongside the Sandame, Naruto had faced the Kazekage, two zombie Hokage, and the rogue shinobi Sannin, Orochimaru. And he had been the one to beat all of them. Even when the Hokage had to leave the battle to perform a sealing jutsu, Naruto had been the one to fight and hold off the 4-cage level shinobi by himself, and single-handedly beat the demon raccoon into submission. Everyone was so excited about his battles that they had pushed his promotion through even with his injuries. Sasuke had told them everything about his fight with the demon raccoon. About how he had been able to go toe-to-toe with it when it was smaller. About how he had made over 1,000 shadow clones at least. How he had summoned the boss toad Gamabunta, the very same toad who fought the Kyuubi with the 4th Hokage. How he had somehow transformed the giant toad into the demon fox so they could fight evenly with the fully released raccoon. And then, how when his arms and legs were crushed he had still moved with his chakra alone, even though it was mixed with the river of blood coming out of him. He had kept fighting, and took down the host of the demon after the demon itself had been beaten. It had taken a horrible head trauma from the beast. His arms and legs being crushed by sand, being slammed into the ground from about 6 or 7 stories up, his neck being broken, his spine getting compacted by the impact, a second major head trauma that actually split his head open and ripped a part of his brain out, and even then he still had to be smacked by an iron club and sent through a tree, crushing most of his face, breaking his rib cage and snapping his spine before he was fully beaten. And that was only one of his fights. Sasuke hadn't been there for the other one, but he had heard about it. There had been many witnesses who had been able to hear that his chakra had been actively disrupted by a jutsu for the whole month he had been training, and so he had done all that, even with his chakra control messed up. Their sensei was shocked. He had been completely caught off guard by Naruto's battles. And when he heard the full accounting of them, he had actually had to sit down to take it all in. And another person was so sure he wouldn't survive. Naruto interrupted here. Who? He had no idea who the person Sasuke had just mentioned was. Of course that wasn't so strange anymore. A name. Naruto, I just told you about her a few minutes ago. She's our teammate under Kakashi sensei. You had a huge crush on her during the academy. I don't remember talking about. What was her name again? It's a name. Naruto, are you okay? What all do you remember us talking about? Naruto told him everything they talked about. All he could remember. And after several small hiccups in his memories, Sasuke began to breathe heavily. You remember everything else, why not her? Why don't you remember a name? Why don't I remember who? His teammate looked at him in shock, almost terrified by what he had just said. Naruto, however, could only look in confusion as his teammate suddenly made an excuse and left. What had he said? 0000. Naruto's condition was stable. That was what really mattered. He had even woken up yesterday. But the genin, No, the Chunin couldn't recognize anyone. Haruno Sakura had visited twice yesterday. And both times she had needed to be introduced. At first she was smothered in guilt at her last words about him. The image of his broken body being dragged by demonic arms made from his own blood was a sight that left her unable to sleep since the battle. The nightmares of seeing his flesh falling off as he slowly pulled away right in front of her would probably always haunt her. Then she felt smothered in pity for the boy, at the damage he had taken. And in confusion soon after her first visit. When she came back carrying the ramen she promised they could eat together, Naruto had no idea who she was. He didn't even remember her explaining to him about his favorite food. He had no idea what ramen was. She quickly spoke to the nurse about it, and Naruto recognized the woman right off the bat. She wasn't sure what to feel about that. She refused to accept the small bud of jealousy about the other woman being recognized while she was forgotten. Even inner Sakura was a little irritated at it. Although inner Sakura also cheered that at least now the little monster kid wouldn't be pestering them anymore. Eventually she had began to study. It was a little difficult with her arm in a sling, but she had resolve. Her slight limp from the fractured shin didn't bother her when she was sitting at a desk reading anyway. Trying to find out how he could remember one person and still forget all about another. She had even asked to study the memory maps the Yamanaka clan made. Inner Sakura mused that having her entire clan dedicated to aspects of the mind in one form or another, made Sakura's friend a very useful resource. They had all kinds of information she was able to study, but it didn't seem to help her find anything concrete. There simply wasn't any explanation that didn't involve someone actively filtering his mind from within it. On the bright side, both her and inner Sakura could agree, at least Naruto didn't remember her trying to leave him for dead. She wasn't sure if Sasuke was going to share that fact with anyone, but she knew that if her sensei ever found out she'd be completely screwed. With all of his speeches about never abandoning your comrades he had given, the fact that she had been attempting to do just that would infuriate him. 0000. Sasuke sat on the edge of the bridge where Team 7 would often meet up for missions. His legs hung over the side. He leaned his back against the rail. The Uchiha was alone in his thoughts, as he waited for his mind to accept what had happened to his best friend. What Naruto had been willing to go through to save him and Sakura. How far Naruto had come since their entry into the exam. And farther still, since they graduated and became a team. Naruto continued to improve, and grow. He had somehow learned an A-rank cloning jutsu. Which Sasuke had learned required more chakra than the Uchiha could currently produce. The Dobi had matched him step for step when learning the tree climbing skill. The idiot had even beaten their opponent on the bridge, while Sasuke couldn't touch the kid even with his Sharingan unlocked. At each turn in their training Naruto had slowly pulled forward while he had stagnated. And then the Chunin exams came. Sasuke had been shocked to learn how Naruto had fared, but his true enlightenment came when he learned that Naruto's chakra had been disrupted the entire time. It was the seal that Orochimaru had placed on his teammate in the forest. Sasuke had seen him place it right on the genin's navel. And when the village elders asked him about it, he had been able to confirm that the snake Sannin had indeed put a seal on Naruto. And then he was asked a question that made him sick. Why hadn't he mentioned it before? He assumed that they would find it when they gave Naruto his medical at the end of the preliminary matches. His own seal had been identified immediately by their sensei. Not that he was the only one who had seen it happen. But Sasuke was less confident in his other teammates' concern for Naruto these days. After he was released from the debriefing, Sasuke asked around and found out that Naruto hadn't even gone for a checkup after the preliminaries were over. In fact, they had no records of him at all. It's not like he could have forgotten it, could he? Who forgets having such a huge seal put on them? But Naruto was never checked out. And because he hadn't said anything, Naruto had been handicapped by the seal. And still, he had trained with the seal disrupting his chakra for a month. Naruto had managed to beat Neji, even with his chakra the disruption. He had not just lasted against him, but had won an undisputed victory against the Hyuga genius. And more, Naruto had beaten the Uchiha's own opponent, Gaara, going so far as to summon a boss-level toad to fight the Aikibi demon inside the redhead. In only a month, the orange-clad genin had passed Sasuke at almost every point, earning his promotion hands down. And he had done it with his chakra disrupted. According to the Jonin who had been stationed next to the Hokage, the only thing Naruto was taught over the month a simple chakra control exercise, water walking. A more advanced form of the same skill that allowed him to run up the wall in the arena. It wouldn't have accounted for the sheer growth that Naruto had shown fighting against Gaara. How had the Dobi climbed so much higher on a single chakra control exercise? Sasuke was almost willing to flat out ask the boy, but he wouldn't be able to help. He had lost his memories. He had forgotten everyone he knew, forgotten the village, his past, the Hokage, and even his crush on her. That was only the mental damage he had suffered. The image of the torn and bloody genin dragging himself by his blood-soaked chakra was burned forever in the Uchiha's mind. Naruto had done that, gone through that to save Sasuke, to save her. Naruto had forced himself to fight at a level of damage that Sasuke couldn't even think of without hurting. For them, he had been willing to die to save them, to free Sasuke from the grip of the crushing sand that held him to the tree. No one had ever gone that far for him. The genin was drowning in guilt at the damage his teammate had taken. And to the Avenger's own dismay, he also felt joy. Naruto cared, really cared. It wasn't some rivalry thing or even simply doing his duty. No, to go that far for someone meant love. No matter how Sasuke chose to deny it or ignore it, Naruto had become his closest, most precious person. Even before the exam they had gotten closer. But now, Sasuke hadn't felt like this since his brother was a good person. Naruto was almost like having a brand new brother. A little brother, of course. And he wasn't sure how to accept that. The Uchiha was conflicted. On the one hand, Sakura had done everything she could to convince him to leave Naruto behind. She wasn't worth the training they were giving her. And Sasuke knew his sensei would want to know that she couldn't be trusted with Naruto's life. On the other hand, Naruto didn't remember her, and this could be a chance to make things work out better than before. There was a fresh start, and she could earn their trust. If Naruto found out now, then it could sour that fresh start, and prevent any true teamwork from being rebuilt. Yet, Naruto wasn't able to remember anything concerning her. Even things said in the same conversation as her name was forgotten. But what if he did remember? There was still no telling if he would remember that part, and if he remembered her, and found out what she had tried to do. His teammate would be devastated. Yo, I thought I'd find you here. It was his sensei. The Jonin was suddenly just sitting there, on top of the railing Sasuke's back leaned against. His legs kicking like a child's, his hands holding the rail to either side of him to keep him balanced, no perverse book in sight. Completely nonchalant, and relaxed. He had nothing to say to the man. He had seen the seal on the Uchiha, but not the one on his other student. Sure, Sasuke understood why he was given the extra training. His opponent was a homicidal psychopathic demon container from another village. The worst Naruto's opponent would have done would be to lock his chakra and mocked him. No one even thought it possible for the Dobi to last against, much less match the Hyuga genius. And it was a complete impossibility for him to have even the slightest chance at winning. So any other opponent being a threat to him was out of the question. However, a cursed seal was another issue. How could the man simply leave the thing on his own student? Unless he hadn't noticed it. The seal on Naruto wasn't like the one on him. And Naruto really should have gone for a checkup. Naruto is going to be fine, Sasuke. The Jonin interrupted his brooding student's thoughts. Even if he doesn't remember some things, eventually the rest will come back to him. And if not, well, He isn't going to let something as small as forgetting a few memories to hold him back from his ambition as he. The masked Jonin lowered his head down to look at the boy. Making eye contact. Sensei. Naruto's arms and legs were crushed. Then, in a matter of days, the bones practically grew back. Now, he has no idea who he even is, and he is still forgetting things he learns about. I know it's his business, but I have to ask what is going on. The boy's arms still hung in their casts, but every time the medics checked on Naruto's condition, the bones were just a little more knit together. It would only be a few days before they were healed completely at the rate they were going. How could he have healed so quickly? Why does he keep forgetting everything about only a few select people? What is the big secret that everyone is hiding about him? And who the hell are his parents anyway? The third's last orders were to release his heritage, so why haven't they? All of his budding questions flowed out of him as if the release valve had been broken off. And the Uchiha himself didn't know why he had asked the last two. His heritage is going to be released to him, and him alone. Kakashi looked away from him, and cast his eye to the morning sky. If he wants to tell everyone, that's up to him. But Sasuke, how would you feel if no one knew who you were, or what you had been through? And then, just when everyone is beginning to accept and respect you for who you are, someone tells everyone that you're actually only the little brother of the infamous Itachi. Everything they respected you for would soon become a pathetic shadow of your brother's accomplishments. You already know how that feels, but for it to be pushed on you overnight is something entirely different. Sasuke understood completely. It was part of the reason he had made up the story about the plague. But that wasn't all he got from it. His sensei's statement meant that at least one of the Dobi's parents were high level. As for his healing, the Jonin continued. It's a combination of his mother's bloodline and a few other issues he has. Not in the least of which is his massive chakra reserves. Naruto has 2 or 3 times as much chakra as I have, and that makes it extremely hard for him to control it. So the best way to make him stronger would be to teach him the control. And in doing so, give him more access to his massive reserves. The way a shinobi channels chakra to their limbs in order to increase speed and strength is only limited to how fine your control is and how much chakra you can use. While medically a normal shinobi can only add so much before their body starts to be damaged, Naruto's naturally large reserves gives him far more room to channel his chakra into than the rest of us, before that damage will occur. And even after that, his mother's bloodline allows him to recover from the damage which pushing too much chakra will cause anyway. That was much more information than Sasuke had expected. So the Dobi had a bloodline that allowed fast healing. And it was on his mother's side. Which meant she was probably the one he would be compared to. Or maybe it wasn't her as a person rather than the fact that he had a bloodline that they were hiding. Sasuke accepted this new information with about as much grace as he had greeted his sensei with. HN 00000. Coming from the training grounds, Hitaki Kakashi silently entered the village hospital. He didn't bother to check in or anything, he didn't feel like wasting his time with some wallflower in scrubs. His talk with the Uchiha went quite well. He had explained Naruto's fast healing in a way that would make the boy drop his questions, and he had given a quite plausible explanation for the genin's rapid improvement. Now he only had to speak with his forgotten student. He had been informed shortly after the battle was over of all that Naruto had accomplished, including the fact that the genin had the 5 elements seal on top of the Yondaime's 8 trigrams seal. It had already been removed, of course. When the hospital staff asked Jiraiya to take a look at it when they found him in Naruto's room, he told them he had taken the seal off the moment he found out about it. They all just assumed that was why the man had been there to begin with. It wasn't as if the Jonin hadn't checked for a seal, so much as he hadn't checked for one where he already knew he'd find one. Besides that, he was looking for something else entirely. And yet, his sensei's son managed to overcome the issues it caused. Kakashi had known he was being unfair to Naruto. His plan had been for both of boys to lose to Neji. Naruto winning just wasn't possible. And Sasuke would have been drained by the Chidori in his match against Gaara. And without that, he would have been easily beaten by the older genin. It would have allowed him to survive his first match without wounding his pride by making him quit like a coward. Only to have him thoroughly defeated so that he didn't argue when he wasn't promoted. Many of the higher ranks had already stacked the matches up. And not one of the matches had gone as predicted. Naruto had won. The puppet wielder didn't participate, and lose against the Aburame. Shikamaru forfeited his match instead of winning as Asuma had instructed him. The Sandaime had sent his Chunin to contact him an hour earlier than they had discussed. And the pre-planned encore of the Uchiha fight was interrupted. If not for the invasion, their entire lineup of second matches would have been a disaster. It was supposed to be Shino against Shikamaru while Sasuke rested, and then Neji would outclass Sasuke and earn his promotion. Ending when Shikamaru would simply forfeit his match against the Hyuga and earned his promotion. But if things had gone on as they were, Shino facing Temari would have been another round of mind vs. wind, and Naruto would have fought Sasuke. Kakashi could have easily deduced Sasuke's victory at the final match on the day of the tournament. His fire jutsu would have been an easy match for either Temari or Shino. However, now the Jonin knew that had things not been interrupted, his orange and hyper student would have been the eventual victor. The Uchiha wouldn't have been able to beat his teammate. And Naruto would have kept fighting long after the other two had been exhausted. Arriving at Naruto's usual room, the Jonin was surprised to find his student already awake. It was early morning, but the boy was happily playing a game of shogi with Nara Shikamaru. Someone that by all logic could never be awake at this hour. The lazy boy had his standard flak jacket on, and another one hung on a chair. Instead of introducing himself to the amnesiac, the Jonin masked his presence and watched as they played. The Nara wasn't just there for a game. Naruto's one-time friend didn't even pay attention to the game. He was more focused on the blonde in the casts. The Nara would move Naruto's pieces as he was told and then tell Naruto things about the village. About the clans and all the shinobi ranks. About their days at the academy. The strung-up Chunin was frantically trying to both learn what the genius had to tell him and play the game at the same time. His focus was too split to play that well, but the Nara never capitalized on it. Instead, the mobile Chunin passed over several good positions and strikes to prolong the game in a way that the other boy wouldn't notice. And with each move he eventually made, he spoke about a new topic of the village. Kakashi watched for almost 2 hours as his student was slowly re-educated. Until finally there were only 3 pieces on the board, and the Nara had Naruto in checkmate. Packing up the board, Shikamaru said goodbye and headed out. Kakashi was about to enter once more, but a small squeak made him pause. Anyo, I can wait if you have something to say to him. Not at all, Hyuga-chan, go right in. Reaching behind him, Kakashi rubbed the back of his head as if embarrassed. I'm just trying to think of how to convince the hospital staff to let me take him on a few D ranks. And with that, he ended up watching as the girl shyly entered the room and introduced herself. It wasn't long before Kakashi noticed he wasn't the only one watching. And slightly more concealed, was the genjutsu that the Hyuga girl sensei was using. It seemed to be having the right effect. Hinata had almost passed out twice before the jutsu forced her to calm down enough that she could say what she had come to say. And then, the jutsu failed and the girl passed out anyway. The dense as a rock Chunin listened to every word she had said and asked what the difference between love and liking was, because he thought he might feel the same way as she did. The genjutsu mistress promptly entered, introduced herself and took the unconscious girl out of the room. Kakashi wasn't sure why Kurenai had thought Naruto should hear about Hinata's feelings, however it was clear she had been crushed when she heard about his condition. From the look of her eyes she had been crying for days on end. Kakashi waited for a few minutes before he entered, allowing the boy to breathe and get over his confusion. Sitting down, the Jonin introduced himself and was met with a description of himself from the Uchiha's eyes. Exactly what did that stuck-up little prick think he was doing, telling Naruto that Kakashi spent all morning masturbating instead of teaching them? His love of the Ika Ika series was not about that. It was about making other people feel awkward. Correcting that issue and telling the hyper-blonde a few other things, the Jonin moved on to the blonde's question about love and explained exactly what it meant and how Hinata felt. He was careful not to mention the girl Naruto kept forgetting. He didn't want to explain this to Naruto again. And when he finished, his student was quiet. Thoughtful. It was clear he enjoyed the idea that a girl would value him so much that she thinks of him before anyone else. And it only took a little bit of smooth talking to subliminally suggest that Naruto may have felt that same way about her. Keeping his hints as subtle as he could, the Jonin carefully avoided anything that may tip the boy off to his little manipulation. If all went well, then should Naruto ever regain his memories, then he wouldn't be able to recognize what Kakashi had done. The dim genin would assume it was his own misunderstanding that led him to the wrong conclusion, and by that time he should already be so in love with the girl that his memories of his feelings for his teammate couldn't change anything. The fact that Naruto already knew that Hinata was the girl he had fought the Hyuga genius to avenge, did wonders to help him come to the desired conclusion even before Kakashi had explained love to him. Score that up to 2 points for the little Uchiha prick. With his own hints added on, the Jonin doubted very much that Naruto would miss out on his only real chance to find love. It wasn't like it was hard to see which of the two girls would be better for him and the team in the long run. His current crush wanted nothing to do with him, and it wasn't likely to work out if they didn't find a way to prevent him from forgetting anything even relating to her. A brief smile flashed beneath his mask as the Jonin thought for an instant, what would happen if Naruto tried running in a forest of sakura trees? Would he forget they were there and smack right into them? The momentary humor passed and Kakashi returned to considering his student. Hinata actually liked him. Sakura hit him at every chance. Hinata could see the demon's chakra and still liked him. Sakura had done something to make him forget her very existence. Hinata would help him to grow stronger and increase his chakra control. Sakura was pathetic on her own. Not that Kakashi intended to let her stay that way. He had at one point thought that she would wake up to the real world, but after he had been so wrong about Naruto, he was going to break her starving body until she either shaped up, or dropped out. Soon, it was time for Naruto to be fed and bathed by a nurse, so Kakashi offered to eat lunch with him later and said his goodbyes. 0000. The village council was at a loss as to what to do. Only the Sanin's presence kept them from ignoring the third's final decree. They had promoted Naruto to Chunin without hesitation or even reluctance. His jutsu was now an SSS-ranked kinjutsu, and they simply couldn't have a genin who knew one of those. And then he woke up, revealing that he had lost his memories and the promotion was unnecessary. However, his heritage was going to be the main problem for the foreseeable future. For one, most of them had no idea what the late Hokage had been speaking about. For another, in order to release his heritage they had to have 3 major clan heads and the Anbu commander witness, because the file was considered an SS-rank secret. Which was the only thing the Anbu commander could tell them about it. There were several others who apparently knew, but they all agreed not to share until it was officially released. Even still, the Chunin was also mortally wounded and couldn't function as a shinobi. The mental damage alone would have resulted with him being pulled from the ranks. But he was paralyzed, all of his limbs ground into dust, and his body was broken in more ways than it was possible to survive. And to top it off, while they could have the acting council process the decree and order the Anbu commander to disclose the file so they could release it, this was the demon child they were talking about. It would take a 3/4 vote to release an A rank or higher document without the Hokage there to make it happen. And they would be lucky to even get a majority. What they needed was a new Hokage. Not that they didn't need one anyway. But the Sanin had exerted a certain amount of pressure on them to finish up with their politics and get the job done. When they simply couldn't, the towering shinobi declared in no uncertain terms that it would happen. And to make it easy, the Sannin issued a single order. Nothing is decided until I return with Tsunade. She will make a fine Hokage and she can also heal the Gaki. I think though, it would be for the best to bring him along. It would probably be better to get him healed before asking her to take the job. But he isn't cleared for missions, he is still wounded. The whining elders would complain about being whipped with a golden lash, as far as the Toad Hermit was concerned. Yes, and that's why I'm taking him to her. She will fix him. The sage put as much sarcasm and condescension in his voice as he could. And when she is done we will discuss her new job. That way, even if she refuses to become the Hokage, he still gets fixed. Their natural response was to argue some more. They argued that the hermit wouldn't be able to care for the boy properly while he was busy looking for the medical legend. And the sage had to admit they had a point. But who said he had to be the one doing it? I'll just have to take that Kunoichi from his team with me to take care of him. The Sannin remembered that the boy liked the Pinkett from the time he had prepared him for his life or death training method. Besides, maybe it would help his memories come back if they were of fond little fantasies. Reluctantly they agreed. Her scores did show that she would make a competent medic. After having her brushed up on his daily care and needs they would be able to set out. Nervous. Yeah, she had blown way past nervous, when the man had introduced himself. Haruno Sakura sat across from one of the legendary three shinobi. He was tall, but not towering. His white mane was spiked and wild, but not unkempt. It shined with an obvious care and grooming that would have made Ino proud. Not that Ino would have been able to do more than sit and ogle at him either. The Sannin smiled wider as she was unable to process his question. His charming face highlighted by the red tear line marks of his clan. Each stripe started at the center of his bottom eyelid, and continued down to his stubble jawline. Answer him, you idiot, voiced her inner self. Shaking her mind out of shock, the Pinkett realized the Sannin had asked if she wanted to help him with an A- ranked mission. What are the mission details? Sannin or not, she wasn't sure she was ready for an A rank. It's pretty straightforward really. You just have to take care of your teammate while I deliver him to mine for medical treatment. She had no doubts about which teammates the man was mentioning. Naruto was the only one of them that needed the medical treatment, and Orochimaru had just led an attack on the village ending with his death. Which meant that the Sannin was going to bring the Baka to see the legendary Tsunade. There was no way she would miss out on that. She agreed with vigor and joy. With her confirmed agreement, the Sannin gave her a writ of service requiring her to attend a medical training course for the next week or more depending on evaluation. It consisted of 3 pages. The first was the actual service writ, the second was a separate list of suggested materials for her to purchase. Finally, the third was a document stating that all materials listed on the previous page were covered by the village treasury. Each of these pages were signed and sealed by the entire village council. The entire back of each page had been reserved for signatures. The Sannin never did things halfway, did they? This was exactly what she needed. All of her reading into the human mind had come up with quite a few things about why her injured teammate couldn't form any memories about her. She had even found a few things that related to her own mind she wanted to expand on. But until she could either use Ino's jutsu or decent medical jutsu, she couldn't test any of it. Of course, that was all a moot point if they went to see the medical legend. Inner Sakura was even more excited than she was. Screaming in her mind that Ino and every other girl she knew were going to be so jealous of her. Maybe the woman would even be able to tell her how to make Sasuke-kun fall in love with her. Her mind was made up. Once the Sannin had dismissed her from the dining table, having paid for her food himself, Sakura headed straight home. Even though her arm was in a sling and her ankle was fractured, she refused to let anything get in the way. So swapping her sling for medical tape and combat bandages, the kunoichi adjusted her leg brace and set out to gather her medical supplies. She had quite a few of them once the hospital staff finished making suggestions. She eventually wound up learning to operate sealing scrolls from the owner of one of the shops she had visited, just so she'd be able to carry them all. Once she finished her shopping, all of the materials were packed neatly away as recommended by the medical staff coordinator. On each outer thigh, Sakura had 3 sealing scrolls full of supplies. Her left, being her dominant side, had actual materials such as raw herbs and other medical solutions from one scroll. A full field kit of any tool or implement she would ever be able to operate outside of the hospital in the next. And the third scroll stored the combat supplies, such as poisons, throwing needles, and combustible solutions. Her right side was more of a storage depot. It held things like blankets, full sterile water canteens, bandages, braces, splints, and other such items in 2 of the scrolls. The final sealing scroll held her various texts, notes, and journals of study. Not only did she have the texts that the medics recommended, she still had her research into the mind, which she had began when she first realized that Naruto couldn't remember her. This included several scrolls and copies of texts from the Yamanaka clan. After those were the 4 belt pouches. 2 on her back just above each buttock, and 1 on either hip. The ones on her back held the emergency supplies, which she would have to use immediately without the time to unseal, including antidotes, antibiotics, and painkillers. Most of these were inked onto brightly colored needles for application already. The pouch on her right hip, like the others on her back, was completely sealed with a release string that would instantly allow her access. Unlike them, though, it held an assortment of ambush reaction needles. These were pre-coated in various poisons, sedatives, and bacteria, venoms, viruses, heavy metals, and other many different agents of chemical combat were all sorted out in her left pouch, memorized to the individual point for perfect use. The one on her left was her standard weapons pouch, with contents such as kunai, shuriken, wire, and rations, and the like. On each wrist she was recommended to wear a needle cuff seal, which could store up to 30 untainted needles. However, she placed both wristbands on her right arm, where they blended in perfectly with the combat tape that extended from the top of her bicep to her wrist and wrapped around her palm, leaving only her thumb, knuckles, and fingers uncovered. Examining herself in a shop window, Sakura realized how different she looked. Her hair had been cut short during the second stage of the Chunin exam, and her normal black shorts had been replaced with a long pair of black leggings that ended just under her knees, permitting the scroll straps to attach without discomfort. Her single weapons pouch now displaced by the other 3. And her face. It wasn't the happy person she knew. She had seen her sensei ripped to pieces on her first real mission. Her crush had been dead in her arms, or so she had thought. She had faced off against one of the Sannin and lived to remember the fear her created. She had been beaten and maimed to protect her teammates, and she had seen one of them turned into little more than a disgusting stubborn strip of ground meat and animated arms of blood. The bags under her eyes betrayed her sleepless nights filled with terror at the sights that haunted her. The creases of her brow and mouth told of her newly soured personality. How long had it been since she had smiled when no one was there to see her? She wouldn't be able to perform her best if she didn't get some sleep. It was time for her to admit she needed help. The nightmares had to be dealt with. 0000. Sakura had been coming over to Ino's house almost every day since the invasion. She was worried about Naruto not knowing who she was, no matter how many times she had been introduced. Ino could understand her worries. She had lent her some of the Yamanaka clan texts on the mind. Nothing that could get them in trouble for sharing, but they were still very helpful. Of course, the Pinkett wasn't there only to study. She also needed her friend. She was devastated by what had happened to Naruto. She didn't even need to say it. Her eyes were all that Ino needed to see. She had done what she could to help, letting Sakura rest and get what little sleep she could before the nightmares woke her. Today, though, a different Sakura entered her room. She was decked out in gear, and her arm sling had been replaced with a fashionable weave of combat tape over her right arm. The lack of tape on her left produced a slight aging effect on her body language. As if she stood with more authority. The illusion was good. Forehead wasn't here to look at texts or hear any of her normal gossip. Instead she asked, humbly and sincerely, for help. Ino knew how to do what she asked, suppressing the images of her wounded teammate. It wasn't too hard or complicated, especially when the subject was willing. But she would need to enter her mind to do so. Her father was able to simply access the mind and manipulate it from his own body, however thus far Ino needed to fully enter in order to have even that much control. This time was much different than the exams. Sakura was willing and there wasn't any of the stress of the ordeals they had gone through. Ino had time to set it up properly, lighting aroma sticks, allowing the pinkett to relax as she opened one of the many music boxes her father had bought her as a girl and propping her own body with cushions. And with the proper time and care taken to form each seal of the full combination, her jutsu was far more effective than before. She was in her rival's mind. She could feel the soreness of fatigue and the slight pain from Sakura's wounds. But turning away from the exterior, Ino dived inwards into her friend's mind. Here she could see the mixed emotions of pride, determination and guilt among others. Those three being the strongest. Why? The pride was instantly explained as the pages of her writ of service came to bear. The mission focused her determination. And a little further on the fear, the guilt. The disgust. There was the image that had been causing nightmares. Ino was certain that she too would be having nightmares as well from then on. Naruto dragging his body across the forest floor, by means of two arms made entirely of dark oozing red blood. His own arms dragged behind in little more than strips of mangled skin was left of them. His legs suffered the same fate. A strip of one leg caught a protruding root and ripped off. Ino wanted to vomit. Looking at the boy's face she saw his head split open, was also bleeding, his gray matter easily discernible from the flowing wound. His neck had been broken, leaving his head to loll and bounce as the blood arms pulled him forward. Even as his head shifted, his eyes remained fixed on the redhead. This fear that Sakura felt was unreal. It was carnage and murder and white agony seeping into her soul. The blonde kunoichi who had faced Shikamaru in the exam landed in front of the damaged genin. Her massive fan sent the boy crashing into a tree. And Ino heard it. She heard what Sakura said, what she felt behind those words. She wanted Naruto to die, to quit, to just give up and stop. Ino's best friend tried her hardest to force the Uchiha to abandon the monster that clawed his way at the enemy. It was fear, revolution, and remorse. The perfect combination to form nightmares. Focusing her soul, the Yamanaka bound each fractured memory, weaving others around them, embarrassing ones, funny ones, and even a few sad ones. Without conscious willful thought, Sakura's mind would rebound to these memories anytime anything would remind her of this scene. That meant that her subconscious had no access to them. Her mission was complete. She was about to return to her body when something grabbed her arm. You saw it, Sakura accused. Sakura shouldn't have even been there. Sure, she had pushed her out once, but that wasn't an effective dive. This was. Ino felt out the mind she resided in. Sakura was still in her external consciousness. So what was this? You saw it. You know what I said. I can't let you tell. The mental construct declared. Ino understood as she glimpsed the mental images that passed through her mind. She was afraid their sensei would kick her off the team for how she had reacted. I don't quite understand what you are or how you came to be, however you're a part of my friend and I would never do anything to hurt her. Ino began. At her direct address of the construct, the second Sakura's eyes widened and she let go of Ino's arm. The mental image faded, leaving Ino alone in the mindscape once more. Returning to her body, she found that Sakura had finally passed into sleep. After weeks of nightmares, the girl was soundly unconscious. 0000. It was the first day of Sakura's lessons, the first of about 8 days, because that was how much longer the Sannin thought it would take to get Naruto ready to move. Arriving at the hospital, she headed straight for the clinic where she was supposed to meet her given teacher. Their sensei had been annoyed when she informed him about her required absence from their team, but he also seemed to relax a little too. Seeing her new sensei, Sakura rushed to greet her, making sure to present a well-crafted first impression. The woman deftly ignored her rehearsed introductions and simply began ordering her to task. A dying man doesn't care what your name is more than his treatment. Work first. And work fast. Most of her day was spent that way. Cleaning wounds from the invasion, and changing bandages. When the Sannin had said that the mission would require medical training, she had expected to be bringing a fish to life, or mapping diagrams of the human body on her first day. Her chakra control was good enough to start on jutsu. And she had already read half of the medical texts she had gathered, or close to it. The woman's response was a harsh bark that medical study was not magic. No jutsu can do more than hard work. At the end of the day, Sakura had been worn to the bone. And that was when the real learning began. That same woman who had bossed her around had also prepared her dinner. And for once, Sakura was too hungry to worry about her weight. She ate it all. As she digested, her new mentor Kenko-sensei explained how medical practices operated. Most of it was exactly the same as civilians had. They had herbalists and apothecaries that created medicine, and craftsmen who created their tools. They used medicine just as much as the civilians did. The only thing that Iriojutsu did was enhance it. Take her arm for instance. It had been broken, and under a normal care it would have swollen up, bled inside the muscles from burst capillaries, and they would have had to cut it open to set the bits of bone back where they belonged. The Iriojutsu allowed them to seal the capillaries, detect any other bleeds, and move cells with their chakra as they needed to without surgery. Some advanced jutsu could even repair the cells themselves. However, the average ones only started the healing process. With their ability to use chakra to manipulate the reactions of the body, they could prevent things like swelling, infection, and going into shock, which was caused by your body sending a message, via nerves to your brain, that said, panic. Stop that, and you stop the body from going into shock. From that point they can pass the bone pieces through the torn meat without damaging it any further. The meat would be shifted to the side with chakra as they pulled the bit back to place and submerged the medical creams through the skin and into the flesh. While it could glue the pieces of bone back in place, it can't make the bone regrow or knit together. That has to happen on its own. These few tiny advancements made all the world of difference. Identification, access, cleaning, clotting, and preventing counterproductive bodily reactions. The vast majority of life-threatening injuries are only so bad because medics can't reach them in time, or without making more damage, or because the body reacts to the injury in a way that makes it worse. Medical ninjutsu or iriojutsu solve that. But just because they have access to the injury and can prevent bodily reactions from making it worse doesn't mean they can work miracles. Her arm may not have swollen or gotten infected, and every piece of bone may have been placed exactly where it needed to go, but it would still take time to heal. The bones needed to refuse and the meat needed to scar up and heal. The biggest advantage iriojutsu gave them, however, was not treating the issue. It was identifying it. The simple diagnostic jutsu that every medic learned was basically allowing your chakra to flow into another person, and molding it so that the person's body doesn't reject it. Once the chakra was there, all you had to do was use it to feel out the issue. With more skill, the better it got. However, most beginners couldn't even mold their chakra well enough that it didn't get rejected, and once that was done, the depth of the scan could range from "I feel your skin" to "I see your broken bone" to "You have a virus in your ear and a fungus on your toes." It was said that the Sannin could even tell you if your child would be male or female only a day after you coupled. Most of the advanced medics required at least a week before they could tell that the coupling had been successful at all. All of that said, it was still far better for the body to heal on its own. Once you got past the initial issues of getting the healing process started, the rest was exactly the same as civilian work. 00000. The next several days passed with her working too hard and falling out of contact with everybody. Sakura hadn't been able to talk to Ino about her mental form as she had promised. And she hadn't even seen Sasuke since she had told their sensei that she was being enrolled in a medical training course. She spent more mornings working in the clinic, and afternoons were spent learning how to use the medical equipment, identifying symptoms, and learning all the different chemicals she had purchased and their attributes. The fact that she never had to be told twice about anything quickly got Kenko-sensei's approval. Her quick study of all of her medical texts over the evenings led to the woman becoming very impressed with her book knowledge. Which led to the harsh Irionen forcing her to practice the practical side of things. She had to do 2 full autopsies and care for over 100 different medical issues over the course of the week. By the time the training course was over, she had thoroughly impressed her sensei. There were only 2 days left before the Sannin had said they would be leaving, and Sakura hadn't learned a single medical jutsu. According to Kenko sensei, most Irionen had to train for years to get any real skill. And many never learned the first jutsu until their first year was over. However, Sakura had proven herself, and so, the first and most important thing she was going to be taught was the diagnostic chakra scan. The second thing was normally reviving fish life to hone the chakra manipulations that were needed. But that could wait until she returned. 00000. The Sasuke-kun never came. Sakura had shown up for their meeting after 9 days of missing it. And didn't say a word to him. She was only here to check in with their sensei before she left later today. She was leaving the village with Naruto and the Toad Sannin in order to bring him to a medic who could fix his memories. Sasuke had to admit he approved of the change. She was quiet and serious. Her demeanor was dignified in a way he still hadn't seen in any of girls he knew from the academy. Her change in equipment was also a welcome sight. The medical supplies and gear were organized exactly as the professional Irionen did theirs. The Uchiha could barely see any of her limp now. The small fabric leg brace was easily covered up by wearing one on both legs. However, the asymmetry of her bandaged right arm added a trace of experience to her overall image. As if it was telling him that she wasn't still trying to figure things out. With a swallow, she looked at him and finally spoke. Have you visited Naruto yet? At the mention of his teammate, Sasuke could only glare at her. With a sigh, the kunoichi looked away. You should come see him off. He's probably going to be nervous about leaving the village. I'll be there. She wasn't even guilty about what she had tried to do. But at least she was willing to help make things better. Or at least as much help as she could offer. How far have you gotten? He asked. With your medical training. Well, after performing 2 autopsies, I'm no longer terrified of Naruto. That caught him off guard. Her casual, almost easy reply. As if what she had done was no more than a joke. And then he understood her words. Terrified of Naruto. Of what? His horrible fashion sense. His jolly attitude. His retarded levels of stubbornness. His reckless drive to do stupid shit. The sight of his bloody flesh being pulled by demonic limbs made of even more blood. Oh, Sasuke couldn't help but say it out loud. Might as well ask his question again. What have you learned then? Looking back towards him, his annoying teammate came to the surface once more. I'm a prodigy, Sasuke-kun, just like you. I'm months ahead of the beginner level and it's only been the 1 week. 00000. Sakura was leaving today. Ino hadn't been able to get her out of her mind. Which was irony, since it was her own entry into the other girl's mind that caused her mental blockage. It was clear that the eye of Sakura's mind had been developed a little higher than natural. However, when the Ino had confirmed her once best friend's photographic memory, it began to make sense. Sakura's mind had developed a swollen eye in order to retain all the information her conscious mind couldn't sort through. It was by no means a split personality. She had seen one of those before. Her father had actually paid a handsome price for exploration of a couple minds who were in the same body. It had been interesting. Yet what Sakura had was basically an overdeveloped inner monologue. It was almost separate from her deliberate thought process, as a coping mechanism for her taxed mind. Still though, Ino wanted to learn more. So she too began to study. The Ide was actually developing independence of her friend. It wouldn't be able to truly split off without some kind of mental meltdown, but it was getting stronger. From what Ino could learn, if something wasn't done to deal with it, it could eventually become the dominant personality. Which would basically be as if Sakura lost the ability to filter her thoughts on her own. Of course, as her friend matured, her still developing prefrontal cortex could begin to compensate, allowing the two to fully reintegrate. She wasn't quite sure how to ensure that would happen, however, she was certain she could help it along. Ino was studying her clan's jutsu scrolls and the past applications of the jutsu when Sakura arrived. She had to hide these scrolls this time. Unlike the ones that she had lent her friend and love rival, these scrolls explained some very specific details which could never be permitted to leave their clan. She didn't have much time and so she reacted out of habit. Quickly slipping the clan scrolls in her hideaway, the place she hid some of her most secret secrets, Ino rushed to the front door to let her in. Completely ignoring the whisper of conscience that tried and failed to remind her that Sakura had been the one who originally helped her create the cubbyhole. Sakura had been run ragged at the clinic over the past week. They never did get to discuss what she had done to help. After explaining how she had twisted the memories around it to reflect the subconscious, Ino told her about what else she found out. She knew. Ino assured her that her emotions had been perfectly normal. What she said wasn't anything uncommon in that kind of situation. Sakura's reaction was to shout at her. Normal. When has there ever been a normal for seeing someone you care about get literally ripped to little pieces and still keep fighting? Sakura had a point. How had Naruto kept going? It couldn't have been sheer willpower, could it? A rumor had gone around about how his mother had a healing bloodline that allowed her to heal faster than any normal shinobi, and that seemed to have passed on. When Ino had visited him, his charts had been far more recovered than Shikamaru said they were the first time he had visited. Perhaps the blood arms had been related to that. Of course, Kushina Uzumaki, the primary suspect for Naruto's mother, also had the ability to create chakra chains out of her own body's flesh and blood. That would certainly explain it. Sakura agreed with her about most of her theories. And to finish it off, Ino ran to grab some of the records she had asked for from her dad's office. Coming back into her room, she showed Sakura the medical files of the kunoichi when she was in the academy, and a well-hidden document about her pregnancy later on that Ino had managed to find. The timelines matched up. At her stage of pregnancy, she would have given birth within the week of the day Naruto was born. Ino never got to mention her confrontation with the other Sakura. They had only just began scheming to find out more on Naruto's mother when there was a knock on her window. Ino recognized the man who had recruited Sakura, the Sannin, and opened the window to let him enter. Hey girls, I always hate to interrupt before the pillow fights, but we need to get on the road. The Sannin informed them, leaning on the sill without bothering to actually come inside. Ino wasn't sure how to react to that, so she just slammed her window on his fingers and turned to say goodbye to her best friend. 0000. Today was the day Naruto got out of the bland white walls of the hospital. The day he got to actually see the village he had been told so much about. He might not get to see much of it, but even the amount of it he saw on his way to the village gate should be an experience. It wasn't time to leave yet, however, he had a few visitors who wouldn't be able to see him off from the gates. His team, both of them had come. His sensei and his partner were leaving the village early that morning and wouldn't be able to see him off when he, a nurse, and the Sannin left that afternoon. Sasuke was as mushy as ever, hugging him tightly before they left. His sensei didn't show anywhere near that amount of emotion. He simply ruffled his hair and pulled out that book. It would be a few more hours before everything was ready to go. But Naruto had many other visitors on their way. After his team left, Hinata, the girl he may have been in love with, or at least liked, came in with her team. He hadn't met either of her teammates yet, but Hinata had been over twice since the first time. She had eaten lunch with him the second time. And Naruto was surprised to hear that she had cooked it herself. It was probably the best food he had had since he lost his memories. The next time Hinata had come over, she had played shogi with him. It took an hour to finish, but Shikamaru took longer. Introducing Kiba and Shino to him, the Hyuga sat on his bed and began feeding him a sweet bun while Kiba excitedly told of several of their joint prank efforts. They stayed there like that until Team 10 arrived. Unlike Team 8, Naruto had met all of Team 10. First and foremost was Shika-kun, who had visited every day to play a game of shogi in the early mornings. His easygoing friend had spent hours telling him about the village and what they all did. He told him history and chakra theory as well as the current events of the recovering village. Ino Yamanaka spent a few hours telling him things too, but most of it was more about who did or does what. It was from her that he learned he'd had a crush in the academy, though she had mentioned it a couple times. He couldn't remember if she ever told him who it was. The short-term-minded boy had no other option but to think it out. And realized that it must have been the Hyuga. It made sense cause she was from a big clan and he didn't have the guts to tell her any more than she did. Ino had also informed him that he kept a house plant. She had graciously adopted it for him while he was away. So he owed her big time when he got out. Finally there was Choji, by far his least vocal visitor over the last week. The larger boy had been introduced by Shikamaru only a couple days ago. Shika had discreetly warned him against a few forbidden words, like fat, and work and barbecue. The larger boy had been his friend from the get-go. He would be anybody's friend. However, today was the first time he had met them all together. The dynamic was vastly different than he had imagined. He had thought Shika would be the leader cause of how smart he was, and he kinda thought Ino had a thing for Choji. The reality was nothing like that. Ino constantly abused Choji and Shikamaru tried everything he could to hide from her. The hour or so of shogi that morning was more chaotic than any of the memories he'd formed so far. Once the game was over, Naruto was helped into a wheelchair and rolled out of his room to where Iruka-sensei waited. His sensei had visited only once before but had promised to take him out to their favorite food stand in the village. The man had been his sensei for years before he met Kakashi-sensei. And had also been Naruto's first true friend according to Konohamaru. He pushed Naruto's chair down the street, stopping every so often to show him part of the village or tell him something the crippled boy had done in it. When they finally reached their destination, it was the ramen shop that Uncle Asuma had brought lunch from when Konohamaru visited again. Tsuki and Ayame both greeted him with affection, a free bowl of ramen from the man and a tight hug followed by a kiss to Naruto's cheek from his daughter. He enjoyed his meal thoroughly. The ramen was good, but the company was the best. 0000. They had been on the road for almost 2 hours and Naruto hadn't said a single word. Glancing back at the Chunin and his genin propulsion system, the Toad Sage half expected him to be asleep. Instead, the boy was wide-eyed looking at the forest around them. Stopping his gaze, the boy realized his wheelchair was moving on its own. Looking behind him, he gave a start when he realized that he had been getting pushed all this time. The Sannin resisted the urge to slam his face into his palm. So rather than doing that, he put an extra bounce to his step and began humming. His great idea, his wonderful, definitely gonna help, method of recovering Naruto's lost memories via raging teenage hormones, had gone bust. He had been told about the recurring memory issue. About the Gaki not remembering certain people, the hermit had assumed that it was random people or even just people he didn't like. But as the Chunin constantly needed to be reminded that Sakura was there, it was obvious who he had been forgetting. Why hadn't the Toad Summoner asked who it was? The Sennin knew he was and would always be a fool, but he had thought that he'd already outgrown being an idiot. When the man eventually gave up his hope that long-term exposure to her would fix his godson's issue, he stopped them and asked the girl. She had been completely confused. She had no idea what was wrong with Naruto and thought that was the reason they were taking him to see the medical Sannin in the first place. She had assumed that her presence was in part so that they could test to see if he could continue to remember her after Tsunade had fixed him. Not such a bad idea, and it certainly made sense to do it that way, plus it meant that the Gaki wouldn't have to remember any of his medically required treatments, such as help bathing and using the restroom. At least, not until his memories were restored. 00000. Waking up, Sakura groaned. She didn't want to know, she had never wanted to know about that. It had been over a week since they left the village and the rookie Irionen was already damaged for life. She had seen things, done things. Not just taking care of her teammate. Although that had been horrible enough as it was. He still needed the wheelchair, but the bones in his limbs had all but regrown, and most of the muscle damage was repairing itself at an extraordinary rate. Soon Naruto would be able to begin physical therapy, to get his body used to moving on its own again. She had attempted to use the diagnostic jutsu to scan over his body and find out just how fast he actually was healing, however she couldn't get a reading. It was as if his chakra was attacking hers as she submerged it, and consuming it faster than she could even pull it back out. Over the time they had spent traveling, Sakura hadn't been able to think about much. She hadn't gotten to study her medical texts or any of the information she had gotten from Ino. She hadn't even considered getting that out. However, Naruto wasn't awake yet, so the genin reflected on Ino's theory. Kushina Uzumaki. Able to heal at approximately 180% the speed of any normal shinobi. Sei had been in the academy at the time, and it was likely that as her bloodline developed the rate had increased. There was still the variable of damage levels. She hadn't suffered any major damage to be recorded by that point in time, so it was still entirely possible that her healing rate would have gone up dependent on the severity of the damage. She had the ability to grow solid chains out of her from almost nothing. And retract them back into her body as if they were never there. It had been public knowledge that the Hokage had decreed Naruto's heritage be released to him. Which meant that it had been sealed by the village. The elderly leader had known who they were. And had kept it a secret. Why? Sakura knew she would find out who they were and why it was covered up, but she still tried to figure it out in her head. Inner Sakura didn't care so much about that, as she did about her feeling of violation at what all the girl had been required to do. So far she had to change his bandages more than a few times, and helping him from his chair to the toilet was embarrassing. But when the Sannin said it was bath time, Sakura had no choice but to argue. With a Sannin. Yeah, not as hard as she thought it would be before she realized that all the stops they had been making were so he could visit brothels and peep on hot springs in each village. The fact that he did so revolted her. And she had been forced to hunt him down and drag him out of each town they stopped at. The sheer disgust swelling up in her easily drowned any respect she'd had for him. And then she found out that he was the scum that wrote her sensei's orange books. Yes, she had been required to bath many of her patients when she worked for Kenko sensei, but most of them were old, and none of them were her teammate. And when she was doing it in the hospital, she didn't have to hear the perverse old goat giggling as he took notes for his next smut-filled publication. Their argument over bathing him eventually got them kicked out of the inn they were staying at. And in the end, they made a fast track for the medical Sannin, and she was resigned to bathing the baka.